Welcome to Herbal Hour, the podcast for budding herbalists, plant enthusiasts, lovers of nature, and all things holistic medicine. Episode 1, East meets West Herbs. Today we have with us creator of ModernHealthMonk with over 250,000 subscribers on YouTube and author of Master the Day, Eat, Move, and Live Better with the Power of Daily Habits. He's a lifestyle coach extraordinaire, Chinese medical student at National University of Natural Medicine, and my good friend Alexander Heyne.
What's up? Thanks for having me here.
Yeah.
By the way, you pronounced my last name wrong. It's actually Heyne.
Nice.
No, I'm lying.
Very
it's
nice.
actually Heyne.
Yeah, so today we're just sitting here. We're drinking some pu'er tea. Pu'er tea's delicious. I know you know a little bit about pu'er tea. Would you care to tell us about?
You know, honestly, the crazy thing is I'm one of those weird people that just knows enough to be dangerous about what I want. I just know enough to know what I want. I don't know that much about pu'er besides the fact that there's mainly two different types. There's like the fresh, quote unquote, fresh sheng, and then the ripened, the darker one, which is shu. I tend to just like the shu because that's like a lot darker. It tends to be easier in digestion. It's a little bit more warming. So if you tend to have low appetite, you tend to have a sensitive stomach, you definitely want to have the darker one.
Well, I don't know too much about tea, but I know it has a lot of caffeine, so I like it.
That's why we're cracked out right now.
Yeah, exactly. Just drinking tons of pu'er right now.
That's it.
Bringing you some good quality content today. Okay, so you wrote a book on how people can change their lives. Why do you think habits are so crucial to health?
I think the big thing is that people want to change their life and they don't know how to bridge the gap between like where they are and where they want to be. And that can be dating. It could be, I never get into these good loving relationships. How do I get to there? It can be fitness, like I need to lose 20 pounds or I want to gain 20 pounds. How do I get to there? I want to get out of this horrible debt, this financial situation. I'm here. How do I want to get there? And like the getting there is the part where people like really, it's thorny and it's very messy. And I think for me, people need to understand that habits are really one of the most concrete ways to do that. Like no matter what material you end up studying or whatever material you apply, it's kind of, if you can understand psychological habits and physical habits, that's the whole game to me.
So what do you think is the main obstacle for people not changing their habits? Because everyone understands that, we are the sum of our habits, but why do we have habits that basically destroy our lives or that are not productive?
I think because we tolerate them. Basically, we tolerate getting bad results. Like we tolerate, like how is it that there are however many tens of thousands of diabetics getting their limbs amputated every year when they saw the warning signs all along? Maybe they weren't 100% sure that was dietary related, but like they see and the doctor's like, we're going to have to cut off your foot. Like it's not going to grow back. Like we're going to cut off your foot and then eventually above your knee and then your leg and you're going to die from this. And yet, whatever that number is, it's like in the tens of thousands, like 30,000 people plus get limbs amputated. So like they intellectually know they have to change. And maybe even emotionally, they're like, I don't feel well. Emotionally, I don't feel well. And how is it that they can still not even change? So I think it's a matter of the inner psychology and the practical application, but there's something in between, which is really where, if we focus on that, that's where we can get the results. Because it's not just info. Almost everyone now in the internet age knows what to do or can find out what to do to achieve almost any goal. So if it's not information, like what is it? And I think that's what we're talking about, which is kind of really character.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's an interesting disease because it's so related to diet and lifestyle. It's pretty much completely preventable from everything I understand. But yet people are getting their limbs cut off because of those habits. Right.
And I think that people really only change through pain, but sometimes even pain's not great enough. There's a guy online called Grant Cardone, and he's got all these sales materials and he's like a sales coach, sales trainer. And in his 20s, he struggled a lot with addiction, a lot with really hard drug use. And for him, he didn't change when he was hospitalized twice from using drugs. He didn't change when he was beaten to a pulp by basically someone that he was doing deals with. The guy came into his house and beat him to hell. And the only time he changed, finally got clean, was when his mom said, I never want to see you again. So it's like, even threatened with death was not good enough, but it was like that excommunication that for him was like the strong enough emotional pain that finally got him cold turkey. And some people even have that and they don't change.
pretty remarkable. Humans are very interesting creatures
Mysterious.
in that regard. So today our topic is Eastern and Western traditions of herbalism. So I'm studying naturopathic medicine at NUNM, as you know, and I'm very passionate and inspired about herbalism, especially the more traditional herbalism, not more scientific-based herbalism. And you're studying Chinese medicine. We're both in our last years. So what inspired you to pursue Chinese medicine?
Very unremarkable. It was for me, I had lifelong digestive problems. I saw a lot of doctors, even really from the age of 20 on, which is basically starting with a GI specialist diagnosis of IBS, which was really a misdiagnosis or diagnosis of exclusion. But GI specialist, general practitioner, even a nutritionist they sent me to, which is very surprising. It's at least, redeeming a little bit. But none of them got me any results. They were all good people. I liked them all. None of them got me any results. So here I am seeing like Ivy League trained physicians that are very confident of their opinions, because what they were sharing were not really facts. They were sharing opinions. And I just didn't get any results. And so for me, it was kind of like, then I went into this whole weird world of what so many patients do when they don't get results is I'm reading books independently written by physicians. I'm even reading physicians in the 1900s, their books, like Dr. Christopher, or maybe was he an herbalist or a naturopath? He has a whole line of like Dr. Christopher's. He had a whole herbal school. But for me, it was just a chance referral from a friend who had, I think he had ulcerative colitis or Crohn's. And he was taking some drug because there was no other treatment, quote unquote, for him. And the drug actually caused that to morph into autoimmune hepatitis. And when I saw him, he was so weak. He was 26, so weak he couldn't even walk. He had to use crutches or be in a wheelchair. And he said, you should check out this Chinese doctor, this guy named Jacques. He was like a French dude, but studied with a Chinese teacher. And sure enough, the first 30 days, like of the herbs he gave me, was the most regular bowel function of 30 years of my life. So it wasn't like he like cured me a constitutional illness in 30 days, but I was like, if this was that easy for this guy, and I was like one of like 30 patients he saw that day, he had like 30 minutes with me, why would I ever go back to studying why would I go back to the physician that was so confident and yet their advice didn't do anything? And then this guy not only could explain accurately in terms of Chinese medicine, but it actually worked. Most important to me, the patient. So then I was really intrigued and it piqued my interest.
That's interesting considering the fact that if you go on Wikipedia, you search naturopathy.
Disaster.
You search Chinese herbalism. I was actually just reading up on Chinese herbology.
Yeah.
And in the first sentence, it's pseudoscience.
Right.
And then it was explaining why we're not seeing effects with it. Is because it has no mechanism of action. So it's like pre-assumed that it is not effective.
Right.
So how do these systems of medicine, especially when they're more traditional based, like folk herbalism or Chinese medicine, where does that fit in the medical system when the medical system at large is incredibly dismissive?
Right.
And in spite of the fact that many conventional MDs and practitioners can't really affect cures.
Right.
Chinese medicine docs and herbalists have been affecting cures, for thousands of years.
Right.
So what gives? What's up with that?
Well, for one, there's a lot of bias on Wikipedia. So it's funny. It's very interesting you said that, because just yesterday I looked at the wiki entry for acupuncture. And of course it was pseudoscientific, categorized as quackery, but it's all the same links to Stephen Barrett at Quackwatch. So if you're a scientist, you don't just cite one source, which is one dude, right? Like, let's be clear that it's just not just a little bias, but there's so much research on herbs for all kinds of illnesses. I mean, in Chinese medicine alone, using herbal formulas as an adjunct therapy with chemotherapy, I mean, there's like 5,000 plus peer-reviewed citations showing the positive effect. Like chemo plus formulas, all the patients across the board perform better. So obviously he didn't cite any of those. But I think the big thing is with traditional medicines, from my understanding, I'm a newbie, but a lot of it, first of all, especially chronic illness, is almost all constitutional. That's a big thing. Like you don't even really hear constitution in modern medicine at all. Like it's just not a word. But if you read like like Sir William Osler, like these physicians from the 1900s, 1800s, that's a really common word, because it's like, why is it one little Jimmy gets a cough and then that cough turns phlegmy and mucousy and he gets some chest pain, while little Sally gets the same virus that's going around and yet she just gets a head cold and like a stiff neck. And that consistently happens over years and years. Same virus, same exposure. What's the difference between the two people? Ancient people knew this really well. Not everyone had the same expression with the same pathogen going around. And so I think that what you see in traditional medicines is, first of all, there's more of an emphasis on constitutional medicine, especially when it's chronic. But even when it's acute, there's a big difference at looking at individual symptoms versus looking at patterns. And I think that's primarily because their whole way of life reflected that, right? Because they could see nature has a pattern. The sun always rises and then always sets. And then therefore we can predict and therefore have some kind of livelihood, because we know if I get up at this time, that's when the deer's grazing, I can hunt the deer. Or I should plant in this month and harvest in this month. So therefore there's that consistent of a system, you can then predict and you kind of know where you need to be. And medicine's no different.
That is very interesting. Reading about physicians, even Western physicians, a year, like 100 years ago or 200 years ago, they really practiced medicine.
Yeah.
They understood science, they understood germ theory and that, but they were looking at general symptom pictures and they were developing their treatments using herbs, even 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah.
This idea that a pharmaceutical or surgery is the only way to treat is a very new development.
Right.
So it's a very strange place we live in
these
days.
It's a big experiment. Even this week I had a patient, had a cervical spinal fusion, and then he said he saw his surgeon 3 years later, and he said, I hate to tell you it, we don't recommend that procedure at all anymore. It's like, cool, now that you've done an irreversible procedure, okay, like that's it? Like, sorry, we just kind of took something out we can't put back. Like, that's a very, it's kind of sad how quickly we resort to that. But people often don't even know the options. They're not aware of them.
Right, and looking back into the history of medicine, it's always been the case that there was practitioners of medicine that didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah.
They were just following the fad at the time,
right.
This kind of thing. Like back during Galen's time, it was just, bloodlet everybody.
Yeah.
There was a lot of good reason to bloodlet in a therapeutic sense, but then it got kind of overused.
Right.
Or they started using mercury for everything because it became kind of cure-all. These days, it's like gallbladder removal or
right.
something. They just, the second that like you get right upper quadrant pain,
yeah.
like that's it, your gallbladder's out. That's it. It's gone.
Yeah.
Like even if it's treatable, even if there was certain causes that led to it, it's very mechanical based. It's very like you have the problem there, we get rid of the thing that causes the problem.
Right.
But it loses focus on the fact that the gallbladder is an actual important organ in the body.
Right.
And in things like Chinese medicine, it has functions considered that aren't simply physical. It has emotional, it has psychological aspects
right.
to it. So it's interesting times that we live in where the truth is like mocked and laughed at.
Right.
And just completely erroneous, dangerous methods are the standard. And you're a quack if you don't practice by those methods.
I think that's how it always is and how it'll always be. I mean, even during, like, I'm sure we'll get to it, but even during Zhang Zhongjing's time, writer of the Shanghan Lun or compiler, half of that book was basically, I'm trying to find a better word for it, but basically a commentary on the poor practices of physicians at the time. He wrote that book in 200 AD. Like, that's 200 years after Christ. And already he was commenting on the low-level practice of physicians. So here we are talking 2,000 years later, and he was like, what most physicians do, like, is straight quackery. And that's the standard. But it's like anything. It's like, you could make that same comment about how most humans live their lives, right? We settle for jobs, we settle for partners, we settle for all this stuff. And yet, imagine just how awesome life can get if you, for example, instead of settling, you do work you really love and that's really meaningful, and then you work hard. Like, that opens a door to a life that's unreal. So it's almost like, in every era and even each domain of life, there's always the standard, which is almost always an unconscious standard. I mean, even physicians are just the most highly trained cogs and wheels. Most of them are not innovators, or even critical thinkers. Unfortunately,
It's absolutely true in the in the Western tradition of medicine, with people like Galen and Paracelsus. They were very outspoken to the medical practice of the time, and
Right.
were basically saying that, oh, these people doing divination, they don't understand that like medicine is like a science that you can study.
right?
And that was Galen's big contribution, is formulating a rational method of practicing medicine. But he was also very holistically minded.
Right. When was Galen? 200?
Yeah, about
So,
same time.
same time. Interesting.
And Paracelsus, interestingly enough, he was an incredible innovator. Now he's thought of as the founder of chemistry.
Huh.
But he was an alchemist, actually.
Right. And most of these early physicians were in Chinese medicine as well.
Yeah, and during his time, everybody was so caught up on Galen. It was just dogma. This is what Galen said, and like this is what you learn, and this is what medicine is. There's nothing else. He was openly burning books of Galen. He was like the Martin Luther of his time, just openly burning like academic medicine books.
You're talking about Paracelsus?
Paracelsus.
Wow.
About 1,300 years later. So
Paracelsus is that recent.
yeah, he's pretty recent.
Wow.
Yeah, he's medieval times.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah. But that's kind of interesting, is that the innovators always bring it to the next level.
Right.
When people start to become too reliant
Right.
on a dogma. Because only Galen really understood his medicine.
Yeah.
Everything that followed from it was just like an imitator.
Right.
Kind of like a religion.
Yep.
Like Jesus could be held to be an enlightened being, or Buddha, and certain followers wrote down their teachings, and then they followed the teachings so closely, misinterpreted them, and then you have all these wars and conflicts.
Right. In the
Whereas
name
those
of God.
people would be like, "What are you doing?
Right.
Did you even listen to anything I said?"
Right.
It's fascinating.
It is, and it's what's interesting to me. There's a really interesting book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Really good book. I think Thomas Kuhn. Mm-hmm. He talks about how really all progress in science. This was an enlightenment moment for me. It all comes from individuals, and individuals. The reason for that is in Chinese medicine. In ancient times there was no standardized medicine. So this idea of modern standardized Chinese medicine is like a watered down, let's teach as many people as possible to get some consistent results. But in ancient times, it was all your lineage. And Confucius has a quote. It's like, if they haven't had 3 generations of doctors in the family or something, I don't want to be treated by them. Because that illustrates in the lineage, like, we know, if you give this herb at that dose, you're going to kill the patient, right? And so it's just so interesting that what you see in Chinese medicine is what you see even in the scientific method. The scientific method is always pushed forward by individuals and never by institutions. It's almost always like it's Einstein and Max Planck and whoever in physics, or it's this person in chemistry. It's like that. It made me a lot more confident in me proposing all my own theories at any point in my life, beginner, expert, anywhere in between, because it seems like it's always pushed forward by that one innovator that thinks differently. And sometimes, we still use formulas from 2,000 years ago because that guy was so smart, that he was so systematic in his thinking, that there still work like clockwork efficacy. I mean, that's shocking.
It's basically that person learned the best of the knowledge available to them from all the traditions.
Right.
And then they kind of took it to the next level.
Yep.
And then everyone learned the next level, but then that became dogmatic, and then they took it to the next level. So that's the progression of human knowledge.
Right.
So any tendency that scoffs at new ideas without really looking into them with an honest mind is limiting human progress, essentially.
For sure.
It's doing.
But people feel safer that way, right? Like the physician that denounces all alternative medicine, from the jump. I don't know what they're thinking. Maybe in their head they think alternative medicine, they're thinking like praying away tumors.
Although there's research for
there
that.
probably is research. Yeah, exactly. So it's like, but if I grew a tumor, would I rely on, if these ancient physicians thought that just dealing with the psycho-emotional alone was so effective that they wouldn't even need to do any other procedure or give an herbal formula, they probably would have done that. And yet these best physicians in history still did everything, still dealt with the physical on top of the psycho-emotional. But it's not surprising to me that, the quote-unquote institution, whatever that is, rejects kind of these innovations, because it's just the human mind, Small-mindedness is kind of human nature.
think it makes us feel more secure if we think that we have the answer,
Right.
and any questions to that kind of unravel our certainty. And in medicine and in healing, all the healing arts, it's difficult. It's complex.
There's not much certainty.
There's no really right answers.
No, and there's no guarantees.
Right.
So that's the big thing. Like medicine in particular has never been a field where there's really high guarantees for a lot of things. There's like, I feel very confident we can fix this, or like 90% chance, but it's always going to kind of be the Wild West. There's so much bio-individuality. It's just like each body is a weather pattern, and like trying to predict the weather is crazy.
I think that's the role of these more holistic forms of medicine.
Right.
Like Chinese medicine, traditional herbalism, is they bring back that way of thinking based on patterns and really exemplify the art of medicine.
Right.
Where you're almost dealing with patterns and moving around energies in a way that you understand rather than, just following this and that guideline.
Right.
That's based on statistics. Okay, so when you're formulating something in Chinese medicine, what kind of things are you looking for in the patient to come up with an herbal formula?
So in regard to this question, there's a lot of different traditions that do different things. I'll share specifically the one I'm kind of mentoring under. So typically what you're looking for, the pulse has been such a foundation of Chinese medicine, but it's almost like the more inexperienced you are, the more you need multiple confirming signs and symptoms. So it's like this pulse with this body symptom, like this pulse with low appetite, they feel cold, they look more pale as opposed to a little bit of color in the face, and they have, dizziness. That's probably enough for me to give a formula with this herb called Fuling or something. So the more experienced you get, the more you can look at one piece of the body and accurately predict the whole piece. So that's where you get into these like stories of like the pulse masters. Like in my lineage, there's a doctor named Dr. Tien who was so skilled with the pulse. And this is like a real human, right? Like this guy he died in maybe the early to mid 1900s, lived to be 97, saw up to 300 patients a day for almost his whole life, like 70 years continuous. Always in a bad mood, grumpy dude, because he just would have, a patient on each side and then 2 assistants on each side. And he could even modify the formula based on the pulse. And when the patient would begin to explain the symptoms, he'd say, "Stop talking, I need to concentrate." And this is not like a guy 2,000 years ago where we're like, this is probably BS. This is a guy, I have a picture of his face. We know one of his main students, like both my mentors, at the school here, I've studied with him. So like, these are like the real stories, this is the truth. And the point is, his skill was so advanced that from that small sliver, just the pulse, he could prescribe a formula with very high accuracy. To the point where he was like the famous village doctor with, literally 300 people a day. That's like a 5-minute or 2-minute, who knows, pulse visit. And then you tell your assistant, they need this formula minus this herb plus that herb next. And so that's like, the more mastery, the more you can look at one piece to accurately predict the whole. But as a beginner, what we need is, for example, we would use the pulse, we'd use body symptoms, abdominal diagnosis, and then from there, probably just looking at the overall constitution. So examples would be facial coloring. So like people like me are, like I'm prone to being very pale. If I miss a night of sleep, I get very, very pale, very kind of gaunt looking. That is very helpful to predict where I am and what kind of herbs are good for me and what are not. Like looking at you, and I know you're prone to having more like warmth or heat symptoms, including your face. You're more prone to facial flushing than I am.
I feel hot right now.
Yeah, and I'm perfect right now. So that by itself that indicates some aspect of constitution or just the current, homeostasis. So really, I would say most practitioners probably rely on some aspect of the subjective from the patient, some aspect of the quote objective, which is abdominal palpation, pulse, or physical channel palpation, and then whatever else is in their training.
So now how do you translate that pulse or that complexion of someone's face to what herb you'll prescribe? Is it like you feel the pulse and the pulse is wiry and wiriness indicates this organ dysfunction and this is the herbal formula for that organ dysfunction?
So there's a lot of ways to do it, but what I'm noticing is that each practitioner has their style, and the frustrating thing is, even among the great physicians, like when you get to pathology, And there's just a lot of layers of pathology. Like, you have to treat one thing first. Like, let's say you have a diabetic patient and they have acid reflux. They obviously need to lose probably 40 to 50 pounds to feel really good. And they're starting to get just some edema on their legs. And you're like, all right, there's a lot here. Like, we can't tackle one thing at a time. So typically, many physicians will disagree what you even start with on that. So what we're looking for most of the time is that usually one pulse quality, like wiry or deep and weak. Like, for example, a case I had in the clinic was a woman, a middle-aged woman. Her pulse was almost non-existent. It was just, you push down to the bone, nothing. I mean, it's just like last gasp of air. And her chief complaint was body pain. That by itself, strict indication for aconite, for fudze. So we knew, okay, but that's just the herb, single herb, and we never give a single herb. So what's the formula? And I think the doctor gave her fudzetang, which is I don't know the individual herbs right now, but usually the pulse by itself can indicate a whole bunch of different formulas. So you're looking for, this is the reason why like yin and yang are so important in Chinese medicine. It's actually very clinical. It's not like, it's a made up concept, but for example, you have like floating pulses are more yang, and you have like you push to the bone and you can't feel anything. That's more yin. And so based on your knowledge of where the person is and the facial color and the symptoms, you can kind of assess the formula from there.
That's fascinating. So in my studies of Chinese medicine, a little bit theory, and also Western herbalism, there's a lot of similarities from the more traditional perspective. So we look at things like energetics. Is the person's condition, is it hot or cold? Is it damp or is it dry? This system actually comes from Galen, and before that, the Greek physicians.
Wow.
It's kind of developed over time. It became the humor theory of like bile and black bile and sanguine personalities and things of that nature. But it's similar in that regard, where you determine the condition of the person's body. So let's say they have a lot of runny discharges from their nose, and they're getting like a lot of chills because they have some kind of fever.
Right.
The conventional approach is, you just give them something to stop the fever, one. Yeah. And then you give them something to stop the cough. Basically,
like a decongestant or something.
Yeah.
Or
it's directly like symptomatic relief focused.
Right.
And no symptoms, no disease, right? That makes no sense at all.
Doesn't exist.
No. So in the Western tradition, which is similar to the Chinese herbalism tradition, you select an herb that counters that energy. So if somebody has a cold, they feel chills, they have a runny nose, we call that a condition that's cold and wet, right? And maybe they have some kind of discharges from their GI and things like that. So something like ginger. So ginger has a lot of specific actions, but energetically speaking, ginger is very heating, it's very warming,
right.
And it's very drying. And it's specific to mucous membranes, specific to the GI tract. So it's like you figure out what condition the person has, and then you deal with it with that herb. So things like cold conditions are like decreased activity, they feel chills, things like that. And and dampness is like mucus discharges, things like that. So there is a tradition in Western herbalism that is nearly identical to Chinese herbalism, although I would say that Chinese herbalism took it farther. And they focused more on it, whereas Western herbalism kind of fell off with the advent of pharmaceuticals, and it was kind of more or less forgotten. But that system still exists. Yeah,
I mean, I think it all starts with, so in Chinese medicine, it is the herbs by themselves are what's called the qi and the wei. Essentially, you have like the flavor and the nature, and then with the flavor, it's like the sweet, sour, salty, bitter, all that stuff, and then the from hot to very cold. But even that is just one layer, because even that is, there's hot and cooling herbs you only use in certain, they're called like the jiao, the sanjiao triple warmer. There are certain herbs that only really have this affinity for a certain part of the body too. So it's like, then you have layers, and then you also have stages of disease. So then there's like so it really is simple at a glance, but gets really sophisticated. So the layer and the depth of the disease, you have to use different medicinals. So for example, if it's the surface, like let's just say the chi layer, you can't use, if the person is, let's just say we have a woman who's struggling with infertility, right? And the Chinese medicine diagnosis is it's like cold in the uterus, cold in the lower jiao. You often are not using the same herbs for the upper or middle as you are for the lower. So then you have to figure out what's the depth of it. And that's what, that's where the training comes in.
For the triple burner or the jiaos as you're talking about, is that a physical structure or is that a metaphorical explanation of some kind of process in the body?
Yeah, so it describes physiology. It's not a physical structure. It's the one organ, I think it's the only one organ that's described as having a function but no form. And people have tried to figure out what it is. I've heard it's like the interstitium. I've heard of all kinds of terms. But basically these early doctors observed that there's a separate function to this. But there's actually no organ associated with it.
It's interesting what you say about the specificity of the organ because that also exists in the traditional Western herbal approach. So the first thing you determine is the energetics. So kind of like the hot, cold, damp, dry, and then there's even more complexity to that because there's degrees to it. And they symbolize different manifestations of symptoms. Then there's also the what they call the specificity of seat, or the location that the herb mostly works.
Right.
So it would be like hot liver, and you would give, somebody a cooling herb that works specifically on the liver. And then there's a third level of specification, which is the specific indication. So that actually, the eclectics developed this in great details. They were physicians in the early 1900s. They're basically the holistic MDs of the time. A lot of them actually were MDs.
Wow.
They kind of, went under with the Flexner report.
Yeah.
As all alternative medicine got kind of screwed. If you guys want to look into the Flexner report and rage, just go ahead and Google it and see why actually our healthcare system is so terrible today. It's a lot because of that. Yeah. So they had this system of specific indications, and these were constellations of symptoms. They were a holistic constellation of symptoms that would specifically indicate one herb or substance. Right. So it would be like, you use this herb, let's say aconite, when they have, a runny nose and they also have stomach pain, but they feel hot all the time, but they have a cough and, their pulse is very deep. And they actually looked at pulses too. They looked at them in very depth. They didn't.
That's cool.
They didn't really have metaphorical ways to explain the pulse like Chinese medicine does. They were very empirical. They were more like, this pulse, I felt it on 20 people that had this exact disease. I'm going to say that pulse is associated with that disease.
Right.
And when I gave them this herb, that pulse went back to normal. So I'm going to say that this herb actually goes along with that pulse. So they were very empirical. They didn't really care about theory. They learned science, they learned physiology and all that, but they kind of threw it away and just practiced with the person in front of them. One of the fascinating things about their approach, and this might trigger some people, but in a lot of cases, they didn't really care what the patient had to say.
You see that a lot in experienced Chinese doctors too.
They didn't care about the history or what they were experiencing. Their method of medicine was, I observe these signs and this is what I give.
Yep.
And it was thought to be that we don't really understand our own illnesses. So a lot of our explanations of our illness can be misleading. People have stories.
The stories are dangerous. And usually the worse off the patient is doing, the longer the story, the deeper the story. One of my mentors says that in terms of like depletion, if you view like a very, very, very weak pulse as like a person who's seriously depleted energetically, or whatever you want to call it, in terms of vitality, just feeling well, that person will often have the longest story. And so that's where it's like, that was a very interesting lesson for me. Just a lot of the best physicians, they just kind of half listen because they know this. They know the pulse doesn't lie. They know the symptoms are telling that, they're the canaries, and they know they have the experience to be like, this pulse, these symptoms, we know what to do to get you better.
It's a pretty fascinating system.
Yeah.
A lot of times, doctors don't listen to patients, but for another reason.
Right.
Is they're just too busy,
Right.
They're just going to send off to imaging. I mean,
yeah.
We have machines that can look in your body. Why would we need to take your pulse?
Right.
Right? Sometimes I wonder why we even take blood pressures of everybody.
Yeah, but I think also the big difference in traditional medicines is they're focused on physiology and not form. That's the difference now, where we're really focused on form. Like, send them to get digital imaging. Like, oh, you got a tumor, like, there's no, there's not much else paid attention to. Or, oh, yeah, look at your, your cartilage in your hip. It's like you have an inch less in your left hip. You should get a hip replacement. Or like, look at this. Oh, wow, they must have pain because of the digital imaging. And yet that's not true for every person with pain. So it's interesting that...
well, that's one of the foundational dogmas of physiology.
Right.
Is that structure follows function and vice versa.
Right.
Always. That if there's something wrong, you should be able to see a structural change. But that's actually not necessarily true.
But it's not really
at all.
true because in what time scale? And that's why I think a big thing in Chinese medicine, the concept of qi is a humongous innovation. Because if you can treat things far before they show up on imaging, and most of our patients have stuff that doesn't show up. Like their blood work's fine, the imaging is fine, and yet they have anxiety attacks, palpitations, they have all these things that don't show up on EKGs, but they are self-reporting they don't feel well. And a doctor, the low-level physician, will be like, okay, I'm going to send you to the shrink because it's stress. Well, okay, well, we all have stress, but that's a very low-level explanation. But we can treat those far before they ever show up on an EKG or something.
Such a common case.
So
Someone comes
it's like half
in,
our patients.
they think they're having a heart attack, they go to the ER.
Yeah.
You know how often that is? And then they get sent home, oh, nothing's wrong with your heart.
Or it's reflux.
Did that help the person at all?
Right.
Now they're just even more anxious because they're having panic attacks. And it's like, at least if it was a heart attack, it's like, all right, well, it's treatable. I have a heart problem. I'm going to have to change my life. But they basically send you off on your way like nothing's wrong with you, actually. Right. It's all in your head.
Now it's the enemy you don't know and you can't even see.
Exactly.
Now it's a ninja.
And then they say things like, oh, it's stress. But like you said, everybody experiences stress. Why are some people having panic attacks and can't function in life because of stress?
And we can treat that easily.
That's the question. Right. I think the right questions aren't being asked.
Right.
It's being... the argument is being prematurely closed.
Right.
They're coming to a very weak general diagnosis and then kind of sending them off. And that's why, these people flounder around. A lot of the patients we see at our clinics are people who've been, to 10 different doctors, and some gave them IBS, some gave them fibromyalgia, this, that.
Some just gave them Prozac.
And some just gave them Prozac, like, go home.
Go home.
Stop telling me about your problems.
Yeah,
I only have 3 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. I have 3 minutes.
I'm not a psychotherapist.
Would you like me to listen or write a script for Prozac in those 3 minutes?
It's completely backwards.
Yeah.
So some differences that I noticed between Chinese medicine and Western medicine is, one, there's a focus in Chinese medicine of using formulas and synergy.
Yep.
Whereas in Western medicine, Western herbalism specifically, it's more of a focus on finding specific herbs, and sometimes you'll use 2 or 3 herbs together. Anything to say on that matter?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. One, I don't even have a damn clue how they figured that out. Like how you could have figured that out, I have no idea. But what I do know is I would never risk using a single herb now because we don't know how they really work in Chinese medicine. We don't, because a lot of our formulas, you have the chief herb and you have the assistants and deputies and all this stuff, and those often offset toxicity. And so we use a lot of toxic herbs that when you put them in a lab or look at the biomedical studies, this herb is toxic and causes liver cancer, liver failure. Okay, if you give the herb alone, unprocessed, without the other herbs in the formula, sure, it causes liver failure. But the other herbs are often offsetting toxicity. And what you see, particularly in the lineage that I'm prescribing in the Shanghan Lun, more than 65% of the formulas have like the same 5 herbs, which are all protecting digestion, which is very interesting. You have like try to translate them all, jujube, you have gansao licorice, you often have like ginger, one of the ginger variations, and those are all protecting the middle, which is really the stomach and digestion. One part, that's because you have to literally digest these formulas. Some are very, very thick. But that's interesting, just looking at statistics, why would the majority have that? And I think that's because they understood, number one, you have to always protect that, but that it offers some aspect of buffering or lowering toxicity or making it a little bit less direct. And also in Chinese medicine, the less herbs, it's considered a large formula, a stronger formula. The more herbs is considered a weaker formula. Because the less herbs, you're going to see much more directionality. You're going to see effects right away. And if you prescribe wrongly, you're going to see side effects right away. The more herbs in the formula, it's kind of like the safer. So you see later in Chinese medicine history, there are like 20 herb formulas, 30, 50 herb formulas, and those are formulas that can take months to see the effects of. And if you get it wrong, like you don't even really know, was it the formula?
So those ones are more like low dose herbs, but in synergy. Because if you are doing a complex formula of 20 herbs, it's not realistic to do 5 grams of each herb. So small amounts of the herbs are used for some kind of synergistic effect.
Yeah.
That's actually a defining difference between Western herbalism and Chinese herbalism.
Right.
Is that Western herbalism does focus on one herb and in higher doses. I mean, there's many different schools of thought. There's the homeopathic school, which believes in very, very low dose.
Right.
And a lot of homeopathics are actually derived from herbs, most of them, originally, and toxic substances.
Right.
It's originally why they were made into homeopathics, because you can't really exactly give people mercury anymore. Right. But if you make it into homeopathic, well, maybe.
Questionable.
Yeah. I mean,
Let's
people get away with worse.
Guys.
People get away with worse.
Yeah. People definitely get away with worse. Yeah. But what's a standard dosage of an herb in Western herbalism?
It depends on the preparation form, of course. But for tinctures, the typical dosage is a milliliter 3 times a day or something like that.
So what about bulk? What about your cooking herbs on the stove and drinking decoction?
They're usually... It depends on which one, but they're going to be between 5 or 10 grams. It's similar
That's pretty common in Chinese medicine.
It's similar in that regard to dosages that you would see in Chinese medicine herbs, like the way that ginger or licorice or cinnamon would be used, which they are used in Western herbalism as well.
Yeah.
They would be used in much higher doses because they are more like spice herbs. Your body can handle them well. They're not toxic herbs like aconite, which can kill you if you take too much of it.
Yeah, 1 gram raw will kill you.
That's crazy.
You have to imagine that. And we do use, some formulas have 3 grams raw, like gently prepared. So it's, you got to really know.
Now, we were talking about this before. The difference in formulations. So Chinese medicine uses a lot of granulations, like powdered herbs, and uses a lot of decoctions or boiling herbs for a while. Whereas Western herbalism tends, at least nowadays, it tends to use things like tinctures, teas, just steep teas, things like that. Yeah. Why do you think there's this difference in how it's even prepared, the herbs?
That I honestly don't know. I don't know why. I think a lot of Chinese herbs just have some aspect of toxicity, and I think tincturing really draws out the alkaloids. But I think the primary method throughout history really has been largely decoctions, and still with acute illness we'll often give a bulk, the formula that they will go home and boil. We'll still give that to a lot of patients, but it's really compliance. I mean, as far as granules go, it's basically, one of my mentors says that he prefers granules now because it's almost like you get a nice Italian tomato and at least they're canning it right when it's fresh, as opposed to shipping it from Italy. It's sitting on a cart and a boat or a plane for however long. We don't know how fresh it is. At least if you're doing a granule, it's going to be prepared fresh right away. But I don't know why we don't use tinctures. That I don't know.
I wonder if that's some way that Western traditions and Eastern traditions can learn from each other in using each other's preparation methods and even wisdom about the effects of herbs.
Right.
Because through this common link of plant energetics, I believe the connections are all there. It just is up for someone to interpret them within those systems. Because here's an interesting fact that I read online. It completely blew my mind. So there's archaeological evidence that people were using medicinal herbs 60,000 years ago.
Wow.
60,000 years ago.
That's a lot of years of transmission.
And the first written down recorded medical systems are, early BC.
Right.
And maybe 2000 or 3000 BC for some Chinese medicine things.
Yeah.
But you got to think, there might have been 56,000 years of more herbal practice of just passing down remedies.
Right. So that's with the Shanghan Lun and Zhang Zhongjing and 200 whatever AD I think it was. If you imagine, he was just also compiling a lot of the stuff that came before him. So his work, a lot of it came from a book called the Tangye Jing, which is like the decoction classic. So who compiled these? And first of all, they're already in formulas. So someone or some group or some thousands of years, who knows, already had compiled formulas. And not only were they in formulas, they were already with documented patterns for all the major organ dysfunctions. So it's like, no one really knows how far back it goes.
That blows my mind. When you look at a writer from 1 AD or something, or 200 BC.
Right.
And he says something like, this is the tradition from the ancients that we don't even have that much information about anymore.
Right.
And
But it works, which is the craziest part.
And it's fascinating, too, that a lot of different non-primate animals will self-treat medicinally with herbs. So this isn't purely even a human invention.
Right.
This is almost an instinctual way of healing that might even be in our DNA and in our instincts to seek herbs. So one more question. What's a great physician story that you know of like a great physician in the Chinese medical tradition?
Great physician story.
There was that one you were telling me about. There was this plague that ravaged some town, and this Chinese physician was just healing everybody, and that's basically how he learned herbalism. He was actually able to prevent mass peoples of dying.
Well, that was Zhang Zhongjing. I mean, the writer of the compiler of the Shanghan Lun. I think he said in his preface, like 70% of his like family clan had died in this period of, I think it was over decades. That was this plague, this influenza or whatever it was going around, and that was what, like, he wrote the dedication to be like, a lot of these physicians, when they get ill, when they're strucken down, they go to soothsayers and diviners and all these people trying to get, like, they're wondering why this misfortune, rather than having the medical skill to actually know why they got ill and know how to treat those things. And it was kind of like, this work here is dedicated to, because whatever, 2/3 of my family clan had died, and I dedicated my life to solving this problem in medicine, and this book is like what I've passed on. And it was just, I don't know if there's a story about him or some other physician, but the famous story about him was that he noticed like something about this guy's eyebrows falling off, and he's like, in 20 years you're going to get this illness, and if you don't take this medicine, you're going to have this. And the guy's like, what are you talking about? And sure enough, the guy actually got that illness. And so I'm pretty sure it's about Zhang Zhongjing, but this idea of like such a high level understanding of physiology that one microsystem, part of like this person's body, could accurately predict what was, out of homeostasis, out of balance, like 20 years ahead of time. And that's kind of one of those legendary stories passed down.
He wrote the Shanghan Lun, right? The treatise on treatment of cold disease?
Cold damage, yeah.
That's a pretty foundational text of classical Chinese medicine, right?
Basically, any famous herbalist has studied that book. That's like the go-to. And it's not just, the other half is all about really, I mean, the whole thing's really about internal medicine, but the first half's about things you contract externally, and the second is about internal damage, basically it's like an internal medicine textbook.
So, physician story I was reading about.
Yeah, let's hear it.
This is about Galen.
Oh, nice.
So, some background information. He was a Greek physician that lived in the Roman Empire around 200 AD, when he was most active. The story of how he became a physician is fascinating. So, one day, his father, who's quite wealthy, a good part of society, he had a dream one night where the god of healing, Greek god of healing, Asclepius, came to him and commanded him to make his son a physician.
Damn.
Yeah. He woke up in the morning. He told his son, you're going to become a physician. This is when he was still very young. He was maybe a teenager or something like that.
Wow.
He sent him on this path. And he studied all the greats like Hippocrates and other physicians before him. And he traveled the land and learned of many things. And he basically founded what would later become modern medicine.
Wow.
2,000 years ago. But it all started from a dream from his father.
That's nuts.
That's pretty remarkable, right?
It's like that footnote, this was once revealed to me in a dream.
Yeah. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if his dad was like, that dream doesn't have any meaning?
Yeah, that's whack.
One of the greatest like innovators of all of medicine would have just been, I don't know, like a fisherman or something.
Yeah.
Just hung out on boats. So thank you for coming in today, Alex.
Yeah.
It's always a pleasure talking with you. We always get deep on some philosophy topics. But this time we happen to have recorded it. So
yeah.
So can you tell our audience what's a good place to find your material and what you're working on these days?
Yeah. I mean, if you want to learn more about really the aspects of Chinese medicine, you can go to alexheyne.com, which is Heyne. Otherwise, if you want to go to Amazon, you can check out my book, Master the Day, if you're into habits and that kind of stuff. And that's the gist of it.
You were doing some kind of business course recently, right?
Yeah.
Is that still open for people?
It's not, but if you go to, I'm trying to think, what's the URL? If you go to alivebusinessmastery.com, you can put yourself to the wait list there, which is kind of the fusion of, for lack of a better word, intuition, gut feelings, I dare say manifesting, where that meets like hardcore business, specifically online audience building. So if that resonates, you can go there.
And your website, what is that, Modern Health Monk?
Yep, modernhealthmonk.com.
All right, thank you for stopping by, man.
Yeah.